studying history and music, or music history. She focuses on the 18th century America, centering on issues of liberty versus power and spontaneous order versus imposed order that continued to dominate that time period. The rest of the information is here, and he's also head of the local branch of Students for Liberty. So please give a nice welcome, warm applause to James.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So, unfortunately, I missed the panel because of one of my classes, so I'm not exactly sure what was said about anarchism from Juliet and Nick. But I just wanted to start with the general definition, if you already heard this, sorry. But, people refer to anarchism as chaos and disorder, and that's just intellectually dishonest. Anarchism, just its definition, just means that there are no rulers, but it doesn't mean that there aren't rules, and there aren't internal orders that develop among people and the way people interact that would still govern most of society. And if you think of what you do in your everyday life, it's mostly based on the mores of our culture and not necessarily the laws of the external order of society. So when the media portrays anarchists, or people use the term anarchy as just like bedlam and chaos, that's just really not true. At least that's not what anarchism is supposed to be. And so I find it a little ironic that I'm speaking at a Radicalism Forum. I realize that anarchism sounds like a radical idea, but at its heart, anarchism is just really the belief that I, as an individual, don't have the right to coerce or compel another individual to do anything against their will, to buy or sell anything that I want them to stop buying or selling, to think or believe a certain way. We teach preschool kids to resolve their differences by working it out and not hitting each other. And this is called the non-aggression principle, and it's the core of what a spectrum from libertarianism to anarchism is around the non-aggression principle, that no one has a right to initiate aggression or force against another person. So if you think of a situation of like preschool kids in a classroom fighting over a toy, you would rather them work it out and share than one kid hitting the other. You could ask the teacher to step in and always settle the disputes, but we're trying to raise independent people who can settle their disputes without a teacher always being there. So that's anarchy. It would be two kids settling their fight without hitting and without necessarily always having to involve the teacher in their problem. So using your words, not your fists, and not guns, and not bombs, that's anarchism. Benjamin Tucker, the American anarchist, in the year 1888, he wrote State Socialism and Anarchism, and he just gave a quick definition of what he thought, just a quick sentence about anarchism. And he says, the anarchistic scheme doesn't furnish any code of morals to be imposed upon an individual. Mind your own business is its only moral law. And so, again, I don't think that's a radical notion that we should just all mind our own businesses and let other people decide how they want to live. There are a lot of issues that could be brought up in anarchism. It's not just a one idea. It's an umbrella and it's a spectrum. It's an umbrella and a spectrum of ideas. But when you're talking about a free society, people always bring up these objections like, well, who would build the roads in an anarchistic state or in an anarchistic society? And to really, if we were going to get into that and you get bogged down, I would have to trivialize anarchism and render it down to these little slogans for people. But just that one question, and I don't want to spend too much time on that digression, but okay, who would build the roads in an anarchistic society? Well, just ask yourself, that question is inherently biased towards the state. Who would build the roads for automobiles that were created by the government? No, automobiles were created by civil society. So the idea that we need the government to build the roads for something that the government did not create in the first place is kind of a hard argument to make. Not that the roads were there before or that the government didn't create the roads. I mean, we're not denying that. But does the government need to be the provider of roads? I don't know, because the government is not the provider of vehicles. Beyond that, though, why are we limiting our imagination to that roads are going to be the only way that humans can ever travel forever? Why are we not flying in jets and cars already at this point? I mean, why do we hem in what we conceive possible to just the status quo? Anarchism doesn't look at what exists, it looks at what could be. And knowing that humans are ingenuous and or not ingenuous, we had ingenuity, and the human spirit is creative. When it's allowed to be creative and flourish that way, to say that roads and vehicles are the only way that humanity should ever travel is kind of it's a closed-in mindset. And especially, let's look at the roads a little bit more, right? Roads are subsidized by the state. And what does that state subsidization of the roads get us? It gets us urban sprawl, it gets us pollution, it gets 18-wheelers that use the roads a lot more than individuals do. So we have mega corporations that benefit because the state provides roads for them to drive around. Those 18-wheelers are putting more wear and tear on the roads than your small cars. So the roads actually are this big like corporate welfare system in a way too. So, and then you think if we would have had a subsidized horse and buggy industry, perhaps we would not even have had the automobile invented in the first place. So again, we're hemming ourselves in because we have this paradigm that doesn't change because the government's attached to it. The government does not change. It's not progressive. We're stuck with the status quo, which we don't necessarily have to. And then again, that question implies that the roads that we have are the greatest kinds of roads you could have, and that it's the best designed, most optimal system. And traffic patterns are like at the best that they could be, and that, of course, is not true. And you can just see one example of this kind of phenomena, not in roads, but just in pathways. If you go to parks or even here on the quad, most people don't follow the trails that were picked out for them. They cut through the grass in more direct ways. So we don't need to necessarily have our paths planned out for us. Humans always find more direct, better ways to go. Anyway, so that whole question that usually trips up libertarians and anarchists, like who would build the roads? It's just inherently biased. It's closed. It's a closed paradigm to ask a question within. And again, anarchists are not asking questions based on what we know, although we do have all of human history to back up a lot of what we say. But it's based on what we could know. And what we know from history is that humanity has always progressed and developed new things, new ideas. Creativity is what makes humans human. So I'm a little distressed that this has to be relegated to a radicalism forum. I don't really think this is that radical of an idea. Merriam-Webster defined radical as something that is very different from the usual or the tradition, something that's extreme, or someone who favors extreme changes in existing views, habits, and conditions, or institutions. So in one sense, I do embrace the term. I am a radical. I'm proud to be a radical, if you want to consider me that. But radicalism should be placed on the state, not on anarchists. University of Hawaii political science professor, he's professor emeritus now, R.J. Rummel, he's done a lot of work into what he calls democide. It's a term that covers all death by government, but not actual deaths in war. So the numbers, and I'll share them with you, these are not numbers that are directly attributable to like bombing a village if there is a target in that village. Like if those civilians died, that's not counted into this total. This is just people who have died as a direct result of some kind of government policy, or whether it was whether it was intentional or unintentional. And if you're interested in getting more of the details of this, I can give you the website, and he has all of the methodology that he's used to come up with these numbers. But just in the 20th century alone, especially the 20th century is a good place to look because it's not until the late 19th century that you have the rise of this modern nation-state idea that we all think is the only way that it could ever be. It's actually kind of a new phenomenon in human history. And in the first century that we see the rise of these megastates, total in the world, you have 262 million humans who died as a result of government. And just some of the numbers, some of these you're probably familiar with, but the People's Republic of China, there's 76.7 million deaths in the 20th century. The USSR, 61.9 million deaths. Colonialism in general, so whether it's Africa or Asian colonialism, 50 million deaths. Germany during World War II, 20.9 million people. That's from 1933 to 1945. And then the list just goes on and on. Japan in the mid-30s, 5.9 million, beginning in the 30s into World War II. And then even the United States and some of our sanctions in the Middle East, there's been about 1.3 million people that have died as a result of US policies, and this is not war deaths, again, this is just deaths based on our policies. So a world total of 262 million people in the 20th century. And Dr. Rummel, just to try to give you perspective on this, he writes that if all those bodies were laid head to toe, and the average height is 5 feet, then that number would circle the earth 10 times. And that number is about the estimate that people always feared if there were to be some kind of a nuclear holocaust. The death estimates are around the same. So that's an incredible amount of death that's come as a result of this idea of the state. And what is the state? So I'll say for myself, and a lot of the anarchists that I know, Max Weber has a really good definition of what is a state. In 1918, he said that a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of force within a given territory, and that in that society, physical force is ascribed to other institutions or to individuals only to the extent to which the state permits them. So the state is considered the sole right and the source to use violence in society. So that might seem that's a bit extreme to consider the state violence, but everything the government does is ultimately backed up with a gun. So it doesn't matter what it is. They might ticket you, they might fine you, they might arrest you, imprison you. But if you try to escape, a gun is what's ultimately going to be the deciding factor. The state has guns, and you're just supposed to obey. So, and that butts right up against that idea, the non-aggression principle, that no one has a right to tell another person what to do and then use force if that person isn't going to go along with that idea. So it's a staggering amount of death, it's a staggering amount of destruction of property, the destruction of opportunity and for lives that came about in the 20th century. We have a war-ridden world, and you have to ask yourself, what other institution has that much power, and has the monopoly on power, that it could extract enough taxation out of its populace in order to pay for all those bombs and guns and warplanes? What other institution has the power to mobilize all the disparate parts of a society into a war machine? What institution can convince enough people that it's okay to kill and maim your fellow man? I don't see anything else but a state that can do that in human history and in human society. So if that's a deviation from the norm, to say that I don't want another 262 million people to die because we have a statist world, then there's something really wrong with what we consider to be normal, I would say. So if I'm a radical, that's fine, but our normal is really messed up, because we should not just consider it normal that 262 million people died, and that's not counting direct combat deaths. That's just deaths from government. So I just want to transition quickly to try to make this a little bit more concrete for people to wrap their head around. I realize anarchism is hard to think of, and it's not something that in 20, 25 minutes I would expect anyone to become a full-fledged anarchist. It's taken me years to reason myself to anarchism, but if you get stories and historical examples, again, like Nick said, I'm a history major, so in my head, like, it's always in the 18th century. And I wanted to study slave culture and resistance in grad school. And an interesting facet of slave culture and resistance is maroon societies. And specifically this summer, I interned at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and not too far away is the Great Dismal Swamp, which has a really interesting history as being a haven for escaped slaves. You see the Great Dismal Swamp shows up a lot of times in the primary documents of the period, and a lot of times what you see is slave owners knowing that their slaves ran out and escaped most likely to the swamp, and they have no desire to go after them, because the swamp was oppressively humid in the summer, it's very inhospitable, lots of mosquitoes, it's just a really rough, nasty natural environment. And so you're not going to see the state, and the state is giving the slave owners the right and the authority to go after their slaves and to treat them like property. So you're not seeing the state actively go after these people in that kind of environment. And even though it's a rough environment, for those escaped slaves, it represented to them liberty and a haven for them to just exist as who they were as people and not have to suffer under the political and the related economic oppression that you found in the state. Right now, there's a historical anthropologist from American University named Dr. David Sayers, who's been doing work in the swamp for the last few years, and I was able to talk to him this summer, and he showed me some of his research reports that he's found, and they're trying to reconstruct how did the societies within the swamp order themselves. And it was a polycentric order in a way that there wasn't one monopoly on the swamp, so it's not, you can't consider it a state. There were several various groups of people who had arranged themselves in the swamp. Those who lived along the edges still traded with the outside world, the colony of Virginia and North Carolina, those two colonies. They were growing crops within the swamp and selling it and trading it on the market. So here you have this voluntary interaction between people that used to be in a state of warfare, basically, under the slave system. Now, as soon as the slaves get to the swamp, they're voluntarily trading with the people outside. And so you have this trade normalizing relations where they're not really normalized anywhere else. And then what's more interesting, though, is that the people along the edges of the swamp are doing a lot of this trading. You see a lot of creamware pottery, which is a European-based pottery. But if you go deeper into the swamp, you don't see any more creamware. All you see is colonaware, which is a traditional African form of pottery. And so Dr. Sayers argues that the deeper people went into the swamp, and it's their own choice. You can go deep, you can stay on the edges. The people who were really deep were the ones who were 100% cutting off ties to the state completely. They did not want to use the European pottery, even if it might be easier to trade for pottery. They were deliberately choosing to create their own African-based pottery. And so you see their self-determination, and it's their own volition to turn their backs on the state. And so I know there's a lot of fears when we talk about anarchy, and you think chaos, but who here would say that those slaves would have been better off staying under the government where, yes, they were in a state of slavery and they were exploited, but they did have their food provided for them and their shelter. It's a much harder reality to leave that and leave family behind and go to a swamp where there's no guarantee of anything, but you're guaranteed freedom. And for them, that choice, it was an easy choice, I would imagine, for those who left and who decided to leave a status system to go trust the wild of anarchy for a better future. So I know this talk was labeled Anarchism with no labels, and again, there's a lot of different variations within anarchism, but anarchism, at its heart, again, is centered around this idea that there cannot be coercion and force in society, that there shouldn't be coercion and force in society. And one of my favorite anarchists is, she's an American anarchist named Voltairine Leclerc. In 1901, she wrote a pamphlet called Anarchism, where she goes through all different kinds of anarchistic schemes, and a lot of those little anarchists, they use the word scheme. I don't like that word personally, but she goes through each anarchistic scheme that exists, whether it's individual anarchism or anarcho-communism, anarcho-socialism, and anarcho-mutualism. And she looks at the differences, but then she says, remember also that none of these schemes is proposed for its own sake, but because through it, its projectors believe liberty may be best secured. Every anarchist, as an anarchist, would be perfectly willing to surrender his own scheme directly, even if he saw that another worked better. Meanwhile, we all cry with one voice for the freedom to try. And so I think, and I caught just the tail end of what Nick and Juliet were saying about anarchism being this idea that humans should be experimenting and trying things. It's an ideal, and it may not be, in anyone's lifetime that we see this, but getting there incrementally, allowing people the freedom to try and experiment different things is what's at its heart. And decentralizing power, giving power to individuals and communities, and not to the larger the scale gets, the less control you have over it. That's the goal. Because when you control, if you hold the power, then you have more self-determination, more agency over your own life. And that's the cry of all of human history. It's you see humans oppressed because they don't have agency over their own lives. And just in closing, the last thing thing I would say about anarchism for us here in America, and for those of you who may not, and then if you're here, I guess you already kind of are a little interested in these ideas, but if you're not fully convinced of anarchism and you think it's just radical and crazy, that's not the case. Basically every major social movement in this country, whether it's abolitionism or whether it was the women's rights movement, you have Emma Goldman, who's a big-time anarchist and feminist, and Ultrine de Clare was a big-time anarchist and feminist, and led the women's rights movement in the late 19th century. You have anarchists like Lysander Spooner, and you could even kind of make an argument that John Brown had a bit of an anarchist streak in him, who are fighting against slavery. There's a lot of anarchist influence in the civil rights movement, and the Black national movement, and self-determination in the 60s. And so I don't want people to be afraid of anarchists. Anarchists have actually done more to champion the cause of freedom and liberty in this country than a lot of other groups. And it's always been a fight against the state, or a fight against the status quo. Anarchism is imagination, it's progress, it's possibility. The state is it's regression, it's conservatism, it's staid. So I'll close it there. I could talk all night on anarchism because it's one of my favorite things to talk about, but I'll turn it over